Ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to be talking about the Jobava London system with the move a6. That arises from the move order d4, knight f6, knight c3, d5, bishop f4, and a6. And this is one of the most popular ways for black to play against the Jobava London. The point of this move is to prevent, the knight b5 jump altogether, which is one of the main key resources in the Jobava London, because the knight on b5 usually transfers over to c7 and forks the king and rook, so this move prevents that altogether. It also sets up the move b5 in the future. Our move is e3, the most principal move, and here today we're going to be talking about three moves that black has: bishop f5, e6, and c5. Let's start with e6 because it's the most popular move and it illustrates, some of the main concepts and ideas that are very, very important in this variation. And of course, there are many other moves that your opponent can play which are not as good since they're not as popular. And hopefully these three moves that we discussed today are going to be enough, which will prepare you and allow you to create your own ideas against moves that you may not be familiar with. So after e6, we can play g4. And this is a hyper-modern move. This is such a 21st century move. And the point of g4 is to play g5, of course, and kick this knight out, take as much space as possible, and prepare moves like h4 and h5, taking as much space as possible on the king side, and also preparing a large kingside attack if the king happens to castle kingside. After g4, the best move is c5, otherwise, what are you really doing? If your opponent doesn't challenge the center, you should be much better. If your opponent plays something like knight c6, this is already very bad for black because the c-pawn deserves to be pushed to c5. And after the move g5 and knight of d7, this is much better for white because of the superior piece activity and better piece development. So after c5, we're going to play g5, kick this knight out to d7, and then we're going to play queen g4. And queen g4 is a move that hasn't been explored much. It's almost a novelty. However, it has been played a couple of times in some pretty strong player games. The point of this move is to just activate this queen and prepare to castle queenside because, of course, our king is not going to castle kingside since we've overextended the pawn to a point where castling kingside is just going to be detrimental to our king's safety. So this prepares to castle queenside, and it also is a little bit better than queen f3 because it doesn't block the development of our g1 knight. Knight c6, we can castle, and there isn't really that much theory in this position. Everything is quite intuitive and your opponent can play different moves and you're still going to respond in a very similar fashion. I'm just trying to illustrate the ideas that you might encounter and how to play these sort of structures. b5 is the best move for black, otherwise, black is going to fall behind. Black has to push these pawns in order to create an attack on our own king because otherwise we're just simply going to dominate with superior piece activity. Knight f3, bishop e7, and then we drop the queen to g3. This is a very interesting maneuver, but the point of this bishop and queen battery is to play bishop c7, trap this queen if the king happens to castle, and win the game. Or if this doesn't work, we're simply going to put this bishop on a very nice square with c7, which controls a lot of the important dark squares in black's position. Bishop b7, which opens up some mobility for the queen, otherwise this queen would be trapped. Bishop c7 and queen c8, and we continue with h4. The point of h4 is to continue with h5 and g6, and if this king castles queenside, we're going to completely destroy and open up this kingside with these pawns. I'm going to show you guys an example of this right now. So let's say your opponent castles kingside. In that case, you're going to play bishop h3, which seems like a counterproductive move. The engine doesn't like it at first, but at a greater depth, it really, really likes this move. The point of this move is that this e6 pawn is quite weak, and so sometimes we're going to sacrifice our bishop, or we're going to play h5 and g6, and after some of these strays occur, you might notice that this e6 pawn could be hanging, and this could potentially lead to a very quick checkmate. There are simply too many moves to show you guys a specific line and move order, but pretty much your opponent's most likely going to take this pawn, you're going to trade these pieces, and then you're going to start pushing these pawns. You want to play g6 at all times. Firstly, of course, you have to play h5. Sometimes sacrificing this bishop is okay to open up this rook. There's a lot of opportunity for discovered checks in these positions. And you can sometimes transfer the queen over to h2 and bring this rook over to g1. And you should be winning this game. I mean, this is a completely winning position. So I would say there's not much to worry about here. If your opponent chooses to not castle kingside, there isn't really much option for your opponent. They won't be able to castle queenside, that's for sure. Let's say they play bishop d8 in an attempt to trade this bishop off and then castle queenside easily after developing the queen. That's not going to quite work because you're going to retreat with bishop f4, and this bishop just looks quite awkward and it's very much undeveloped. So you're going to get something like knight e7, trying to bring this bishop out, this queen out, and then castle queenside. Thankfully, our pieces are already so much more active that we can stop all of that and put black in a very cramped position by playing, once again, bishop h3, let's say bishop b6, and then you continue with h5. You really don't have to do much to stop black from castling queenside. Maybe some trades occur, and you get queen c6, and after queen c6 you can just play bishop d6, and of course castling queenside here is not possible. In fact, castling anywhere isn't possible because you end up losing this knight. And so this knight has to go somewhere, and the only square for it really is c8 or g8. Either one isn't quite good, but let's say knight c8, and then you just bring this bishop back to a3. This stops any sort of castling queenside. It also controls this very strong dark square diagonal, and this is really where the line ends. I mean, there are so many potential moves here for your opponent. This bishop is incredibly passive. This knight is quite useless because it has no good squares it can jump to. And so in this line, white ends up in a far more superior position. That summarizes the move e6. Let's move on to the move c5. And before we do that, if you've been finding this video useful, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps my channel out a ton, and it will help you stay notified when future videos come out. So c5 is more direct. It's a clear attack in the center, and the point is that since our knight is on c3, we can't really defend the center with the move c3 as we normally would in most sort of London structures. So here we have to act differently. We're going to take the pawn, and then we're going to attempt to cling onto this pawn and make it impossible for black to recapture it. So knight c6, a3, preparing b4, and we might get e5 here. If you get e6, this is kind of very passive. You can just play b4 right away, and black really has no compensation for the lost pawn whatsoever. So e5 is sort of the better move because you're taking more space in the center, and then you play bishop g5. Now, what you might notice is that this capture is not possible because then you can simply capture this knight and win this pawn. And even if black chooses to recapture with the pawn instead of the queen, you still have the same thing because both the knight and the queen attack this d5 square. Instead, black has to play bishop e6, after which we can play b4, and now we're solidified and we're up an entire pawn. The problem is black has better development and a stronger center, so we have to mitigate that by moving our pieces around, shuffling them around, and sometimes trading. We're just up an entire free pawn, so this should be quite comfortable for us if we play this in the right way. Our biggest weakness right now is the c2 pawn, so we have to move it. The way we can do that is by placing this knight on a4 at a certain point in the game, and then just pushing the pawn to c3 or c4. Usually c4 to create some sort of break. I'm going to show you guys an example line of that. So after bishop e7, knight f3, let's say castles, and bishop e2, we get something like normal development with queen c7. You can already jump the knight to a4 and prepare c4. Now there's no actual theory in these positions, so I just prepare certain moves and then showcase them. Your opponent can play a million different things here, but let's say they just play knight e4, for example. You can take this bishop. After the queen recaptures, you can play the immediate c4, and after the pawn captures, you have just a very nice queen c2, which forks the knight and pawn. So if something like b5 happens, this doesn't quite work because you can take this knight, and then you can take this knight. So black is forced to respond with something like f5, after which you can simply take this pawn, and you're on your way to winning this game. Of course, b5 doesn't work here because you can take this bishop and then move your knight to safety, and at that point you're just up an entire free pawn with no compensation whatsoever for black. That actually summarizes the c5 move entirely. The point I have to really emphasize is the fact that in any variation where you can win a free pawn and then try to hang on to it, in the Jobava London, you're going to have a weak c2 pawn, and usually it's going to be doubled. So in order to kind of capitalize on your advantage, you're trying to get rid of this pawn by moving your knight, first of all, and then pushing it to c4. The reason that c4 works is because we have a very nice queen c2 in the end, which forks both the knight and the pawn. Without queen c2, we wouldn't really be able to do anything because this bishop supports this c4 square. So it's important to remember these minor nuances and keep them in mind in your own games. That covers c5. Now let's talk about bishop f5. So bishop f5 is a very popular move, and it's a very tricky move. The point of bishop f5 is that black wants to play e6, and by doing so, black will already have his bishop out, and that way we cannot play g4 like we normally would in a regular e6 variation, since both the knight and the bishop are going to be attacking this g4 square. So we have to play this a little bit differently. We have to approach this in a different manner. The most popular move here is f3 and then followed by g4, which is fine, but it gives black a chance to equalize and actually get a small advantage. So instead, I have prepared this nice knight f3 move, which is still going to allow us to play g4 in the near future. e6 and knight e5. And by the way, if your opponent chooses to play knight c6, which prevents knight e5, you actually have just the immediate bishop d3. There's no real reason to try for any g4 opportunities. You can just play bishop d3 and get a slightly better position where you're going to be more active. So this bishop has to trade, otherwise, I mean, black is going to be worse. If they go back, black just wastes the tempo, and you're able to capitalize on that. So, of course, black will choose to trade this bishop, and here you actually have two options. You can recapture with the queen, or better, you can recapture with the c-pawn. And the reason that this is better is, well, the c-pawn is quite bad on the c2 square because this knight blocks it from developing itself. So now this pawn actually has a purpose. It controls the e4 and c4 squares, and it also prepares the eventual e4, which we're going to play pretty much in every game with a pawn on d3. So you're going to do something like castle. You're going to bring this rook to e1, maybe queen to d2 or e2. And then you're going to play e4 at a certain point in the game. And you should be quite well in that situation. That being said, most opponents are going to play e6. And afterwards, we can play knight e5. And here there's plenty of moves. Let's firstly discuss the move knight b to d7. So this move just applies pressure to this knight. We can continue with g4. If this bishop goes back, this is quite good for white, because now this bishop's quite passive. You can take it, and then you can just develop normally as you would. Now, of course, if that does not happen and your opponent takes this knight, you capture this bishop with your g-pawn. This knight has to go back somewhere to c6 or maybe even d7, in which case you will simply capture this pawn. And now the game is quite equal with, somewhat equal chances. I'd say white has a slight advantage, and the engine would agree. The reason behind that is that this e6 pawn is a backwards pawn. There are no adjacent pawns which could protect it, which means that it's a permanent weakness that we can capitalize on. So you're going to place the bishop on h3, and then you're going to continue to chip away at this pawn. You're going to play something like queen d3, you're going to castle queenside, and you should be fine from there. The exact same could be said about the move knight c6. There's really no difference, just g4 once again. And the line pretty much is going to be the exact same, so this can happen. And with the knight on c6, the ideas are the exact same. Your opponent can also play knight f to d7 and try to be a little bit quirky and trade this knight off without really damaging the pawn structure. We're still going to play g4, send this bishop back to g6, then we're going to take it, and we're going to play e4. So immediately striking the center, really this position is quite equal, so we have double black's pawns, but black has an open file. But the move e4 is what gives us a minor advantage. It gives us a space advantage, and after this pawn capture happens, we can continue with c3 in the future, but we can also place this bishop on g2. So after something like knight c6 and bishop d2, we have a very nice position. We have the bishop pair, which is once again very nice. And then we can continue expanding with c3, maybe queen d3, castling queenside, and just slowly build up on the pressure. The move that you will encounter the most is the move knight b to d7, which is the most intuitive move. It challenges this knight. And of course, after g4 and all of these trades occur, you should be quite fine. This position is not to be dismissed. It has been reached a couple of times by very strong players. So this is something you might encounter in one of your games. And if you do, now you'll know exactly how to play against it. Guys, this sums up everything I wanted to show you for the A6 variation of the Jobava London system. Hope you found this video useful, and if you did, please consider checking out a video to my left. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in a future video.